So, once again, we have another truly great panel. I would also remind those of you who haven't yet signed up for this Friday's conference on campus on engaging communities in issues of resilience. You still have time to do that. If you haven't heard about it, we're bringing together faculty and engineers and community advocates and other people who have been looking at issues of resilience, sustainability, and energy management in this part of the world. It's Friday from about 9 until 1:30. City Councilor Michelle Wu will be our keynote speaker at noon. There's no cost. We only ask that you let us know that you're coming so that we can try to provide enough seating. We already have over 200 people who've signed up for that. So if you do have an interest in resilience and how cities in the region are dealing with natural and other kinds of catastrophes in terms of recovery, please feel free to join us Friday morning. And with that, Jonathan, you're on.
Okay, thank you, Ted. I'm going to have the panel come up and I'll introduce them in a minute. I just wanted to give you a quick preview about next week. There was some criticism at the Democratic debate last night that climate change didn't even come up. We're going to rectify that next Wednesday with a whole session devoted to climate change, anchored by Gina McCarthy, the former head of the EPA under President Obama, will be here, and I'll be having a conversation with her, focusing on politics, millennials, Gen Z, and climate change, looking at questions of whether climate change will be a mobilizing issue in the campaign and what young people can do to push that forward. She'll be joined after our conversation by two panelists, the head of the School of Public Policy here, Jenny Stevens, who specializes in the environment, and also a photojournalist, formerly with the Boston Globe, Dave Arnold, who's done a terrific and very moving look at the glaciers and coral reefs. He's gone and kind of looked at old photos and film of coral reefs and glaciers and gone back, flown back and dived under the water and taken pictures of what those reefs and glaciers look like 50 years later. And it's pretty haunting and pretty upsetting. So I think it's going to be a very powerful evening. Following that, on the 30th, we're going to have a session on criminal justice, gun control, and the campaign, including several experts looking at inequities in the criminal justice system, gun violence, the reality of gun violence, and also gun control to get a sense of how that may play out. Why don't I first ask the three panelists to come up, and I'll introduce them on the panel so we can attach names to faces. So Kim, Lila, Nate, you want to come on up and take these three middle seats in no political order. And I'll sit on one side and then Ted will sit on the other. So the theme of tonight is the media and the election. And we're going to be looking at two aspects of it. One is kind of what has the media learned or not learned since 2016. As we've discussed before, there was a sense that the media really got it wrong in 2016 in terms of missing the rise of Trump, missing the issues that propelled him, and being kind of caught flat-footed on election night. There's been a lot of soul-searching on the part of the media since then, so I'd like to explore whether the media is doing a better job, but then also the role the media is playing in the kind of political ecosystem these days. The folks here represent different nodes of the media, and I think will have an interesting perspective that they're going to share with us. Kim Atkins is from WBUR. She's the Washington correspondent for WBUR based in D.C. She also appears regularly on MSNBC as an analyst. Kim started out as a lawyer and then decided she hated the law and became a journalist. So one for our side. She spent a number of years in Washington working for legal publications, writing for the Boston Herald, and now is working for WBUR and the broader NPR ecosystem, as well as being an analyst on MSNBC, and has really seen the enormous change in sort of how the media deals with Washington in her years down there. Next to her is Lila Alphonse. Lila is one of the managing editors of U.S. News and World Report. Lila started her career, actually as did Kim, early on at the Boston Globe. She then went to Yahoo News. She's now at U.S. News, and again brings kind of a perspective to sort of how Washington has changed and how reporting in Washington has changed. She's also a guest professor this semester teaching a course on race in the media, which students are really enjoying. And then on the left, although that may be an unusual position for him, is Nate Fredman. Nate is an alum of Northeastern, graduated, and his very first co-op was at a small startup in New York, which was known as Fox News. He worked for this guy named Bill O'Reilly, and basically did his second co-op there and his third co-op, and then got hired and basically rose to become Bill O'Reilly's executive producer at a time when O'Reilly was not only one of the most controversial people on cable news, but the most influential. O'Reilly's show was the most watched show on cable news in the country, and as a result of O'Reilly's impact, Fox and O'Reilly had regular interviews with President Trump during the campaign, and the first interview that Trump gave in the White House during the first Super Bowl. O'Reilly left Fox News, as we know. In the years after that, Nate was a political consultant, a media consultant, and then has just started as in charge of all the digital content of The Hill. The Hill is a really interesting organization. It's very much sort of down the middle and trying to kind of present both sides. And they're also trying to attract younger viewers, whereas Fox, as Nate may talk about, skewed to an older, more conservative audience. The Hill is aiming at a different demographic, people under 30, and having some success. So Nate has both insights into kind of Fox and the rise of Fox and what Fox's mission was, as well as now in his new job, understanding where the campaign may be headed and the role that different media organizations may be playing. So let's start. Ted, if you want to join me up here. Just so the panelists know, the only criticism we've gotten from this terrific course is that people sometimes don't speak into the mics, and that makes it hard for the live stream audience and for people here. So here are your waters. So I'd like to start with Nate's end of the table. And Nate, if you could maybe talk a little bit about, Fox when you got there, Fox's rise, and kind of looking back, the role Fox has played politically in the world that we live in now.
So I think when you think about Fox, I think most people here probably think of the current iteration of Fox, which is, especially during prime time, it's exclusively pro-Trump. There's no sort of nuance to that. There's a news side that covers the news, but it's sort of the prime time lineup and the morning too, which is very pro-Trump. That's not, Fox at the creation was something sort of a little bit different. It was created to fill this void in the media landscape that for people who felt sort of disenfranchised by the existing media outlets, that they thought they didn't reflect their views, and that's sort of the genesis of Fox. It's sort of transformed. I think sort of Trump has sort of transformed it to something slightly different than the original sort of thesis of what they were going for. I was there for a very long time and sort of saw the transformation of what happened there. And I think just in terms of how that sort of plays into President Trump is the themes that like the Fox audience, the themes that Fox hit upon for years are very much so the themes that Trump picked up on. So it's not worth sort of getting into whether or not he, like, which came first, or is it his thinking aligned, or did he see it at Fox? But what is very clear is that during the last election cycle, when he spoke about, even at his campaign launch, illegal immigration in these very stark ways. This was sort of language and topics that may have been new to maybe most of you here, new to a large portion of the American public, but it was not new to the Fox audience. So it sort of gives a little bit of that explanation that these themes that he picked up on were very much so sort of in that ecosystem already, and he obviously amplified it as he, when he was first a candidate. I think, people sort of took him not seriously. I think that was the reaction, and then we saw what happened, and that's sort of a piece of context that's sort of, I think, missing when you go back and look at sort of how he rose and sort of how it was covered by media outlets.
Lila, could you talk a little bit about how you've seen reporting and coverage in Washington change by the media, and kind of where things are headed? I mean, is this polarization something that kind of just sprung up in 2016, or is it something that's been building for a while?
I would say it's been building for a while, but I think it rapidly accelerated in 2016. And I think that you're right in describing the media as caught flat-footed during the election. In our newsroom, we, like most newsrooms, had pre-written B-roll that we were getting ready to flesh out once the final numbers came in around 8 o'clock. We realized that we had to toss everything out, start from scratch, because what was happening isn't what we or other members of the media had assumed would happen. Having to pivot in the middle of an election, that's nothing new. Media does that. Reporters are used to doing that. Editors are used to doing that. I think what happened next, though, was where the acceleration came in. The assumption is that you can go to a press briefing at the White House and that is a reliable source. We discovered that it no longer was, that there are alternative facts, that there are alternative storylines that, as you scramble to fact check, continue to play out. So I think the media, both print and broadcast, had to learn how to adjust. You see now on CNN fact checking in real time, whether it's as a graphic that's up next to the person giving the speech, or whether it's underneath in the lower third. You see a lot of fact checking going on beforehand on Medium, on other sites where you're able to annotate speeches and annotate articles. There's a lot of explaining going on. That's new. We didn't feel, there wasn't a need to fact check in real time before this. There was always a need to fact check, but maybe not in real time. I think another big change that you're seeing is more skepticism, more reliance. Well, I want to say more of a reliance on unnamed sources, but that's tricky. Anyone who's been in who's worked in a newsroom and has covered the White House or covered politics may know that there are press briefings, conference calls regularly. And everyone on the call knows who is speaking to you. Everyone on the call knows that it's either off the record or on background. So you can quote the general ideas, but you can't identify the person. And everyone knows that they're senior officials in the administration. So the idea that the unnamed source is some sort of a leaker or something unreliable, that's something the media is now pushing back against, because we know who these people are, but our code of ethics doesn't permit us to disclose rather, when we've been told it's off the record or on background. I think the other big change you've seen is a willingness to call a lie, which didn't used to happen. We've had many discussions about whether when you call something a lie, whether you're also calling the person a liar, and discussions about intent and discussions about expectations. And I think what you're seeing in general in a lot of the mainstream outlets is a new willingness to say, this is not true, here's the truth. This is not what happened. Here are the sources that you can go back and look at. We're seeing the same factual errors come up over and over, and people are no longer willing to just report it, to do stenography, and let the reader decide, because between the mainstream news and other non-news outlets that are also pushing news, it's too easy to get confused between what's legitimate and what's not.
Kim, you know, it's interesting. We've often talked about multi-platforms and the way in which people have to now be comfortable on radio and TV and writing and so forth. But you also, I think, are part of this new, maybe it's the era, I don't want to say celebrity journalist, but multi-platform journalist in the sense that you're appearing on MSNBC, you're on WBUR, you've been on Fox. Can you talk a bit about how that role of a journalist is kind of, if not celebrity, as sort of pundit or you know, kind of in the spotlight, and also a much more public-facing role where people can follow you on Twitter, they control you, they can get at you in a way that wasn't true even 5 years ago, what that's like being so visible in such a kind of intense environment?
Can you hear me now? Yeah, it's been quite a ride, honestly. I mean, when I came to Washington, D.C., I was a newspaper girl. I had worked at the Globe and Herald here for many years. I worked for print publications while I was there, and you know, television broadcast wasn't something that I had thought about, but as I was there, the landscape of media changed, and particularly in political reporting, that news networks, cable news networks in particular, in its quest to sort of cover this fast-moving kind of environment that Washington politics became, tapped the resources that were there. And one of those resources were reporters who were able to go on camera and explain what is going on, to talk about their reporting, to explain to you what it meant, and why a certain thing might be important or something isn't. And that has certainly helped cable news sort of stay ahead of reporting this. And it also, yeah, you're very right. It put me in a more prominent position. I consider the job that I do, I have to stand by my work no matter whether I'm talking on a cable news network or whether it's something that's under my byline. But that being out front is different. I mean, people stop on the street to either say, you know, I really appreciate the work that you do. Journalism is important right now. Or to call me, you know, an Obama-loving four-letter word or something else. And so that in-your-faceness is interesting and new. And, you know, I try to focus on the work as much as I can and make sure that we have some integrity. But I want to speak a little bit to the other point that we were talking about and defend my industry a little bit. There were a lot of mistakes made in 2016, to be sure, without question. And there were certainly a lot of surprises that happened. Not I think that journalism, there was a lot of journalism that was gotten right. You know, I can speak from my experience specifically. Before 2016, I wrote multiple stories, not only at the ability of Donald Trump to win the election, but literally with math and a map, pointing out on the electoral map the multiple paths he had to a victory in the weeks leading up to Election Day. I know I and a lot of my colleagues were reporting very, very clearly about racial issues, issues about race that he was talking about, things that he was talking about with respect to immigrants, with respect to a lot of the policies that he put forward. That's where the reporting in a very frank way, I mean, we had that issue. We had to struggle with whether we call a lie, and journalists started calling a lie a lie. we had to struggle with whether we called something racist or not, and journalists started calling things racist. Journalists started making comparisons to history and things that happened. So I think a lot of that did happen before the election. I know when an election happens and you look back to see what happened, and especially when it's so many emotions as it is, there's a desire to find bad guys, find people to blame for it. And I think media are one of those industries that are to blame for it. Again, a lot of mistakes were made, but a lot of things were done right too. And so I just wanted to push back on that a little bit.
No, that's great. Let me do I'll call it the accountability round, which is, so starting with Nate, I mean, there are some people, even people probably here at Northeastern who will say, back when you worked for O'Reilly at Fox, and now, why are you even bringing someone from Fox News to campus? They're state-run media, they're not real journalists, they're poisoning the atmosphere. I'm sure you've seen or read all these things. What's your response to that?
My response is, first off, I have a degree from Northeastern in journalism, and my role there, I worked at an opinion show, but my role was very journalistic, that I provided a journalistic check on sort of the opinion of what we do. I think something else that may be surprising to a lot of people is that there are a lot of very good journalists who work at Fox. I think that sometimes that may be missed or overlooked or just dismissed because the loudest voices get the most attention there. And I think you may be surprised that and I think this is at almost every media organization, not everyone who works there thinks exactly the same way. And one of the reasons sort of Fox has been successful is that a lot of the producers there can sort of understand the audience and sort of can figure out what the audience wants and balance it in a creative way. And there's something to the point, like a good television news producer sort of understands the audience and can understand both sides. And, if you're a good producer, you could one night produce something on Fox in prime time, the next night produce something on MSNBC in prime time, because your job is to understand all the sides, understand your audience, produce something compelling. And I think that sort of nuance and context does not sort of fit in the sort of tribalistic mindset where a lot of the American public is, and a lot of what the audience sees. You see one thing on Fox, you see another thing on MSNBC, but there's a little bit more nuance and context into the process of how it's made and who works there.
Lila, I mean, Kim makes a defense of journalism, which I support, but you made a comment which I thought was interesting. You said, at 8 o'clock, you suddenly realize in the newsroom, whoops, we've got to kind of go the other way. And if we do turn kind of the scrutiny on ourselves, what was at the root of that? Was it that journalists did come from a kind of a more elite background, or that they were clustered in the major cities, or that local news had shut down so reporters weren't used to being out in Wisconsin and Texas and Michigan and talking to people? I mean, was there a structural problem with the media that made people think we've got to kind of approach the world a bit differently?
Yes. I think there were several, actually, and I think those built slowly over time. I think one of them was that a lot of the reporters who were doing, as you described, the legwork, the painting the picture, looking at the map, running the numbers, were being ignored by other members of the media. I think that you mentioned also, I think there's a sense of a need to play to your audience, to preach to your choir, that has only become more and more entrenched over time. Part of that is because you need to build a loyal audience, an audience that's loyal to your brand, in order to be able to serve up advertising, in order to be able to look at your traffic numbers. And I think that worked against different portions of the media at different points. I think there was a big, you see it a lot now. People don't get the difference between opinion journalism and fact-based news journalism, reported journalism. And it's not just Fox, frankly. You see it at MSNBC, you see it at CNN, you see it in the pages of the New York Times when Maureen Dowd is taken to task for holding an event for Nancy Pelosi. they say, how can you cover her, but also host this book party when she's one of your guests? She's an opinion journalist. She's not required to be unbiased. She's not required to make sure that she maintains this facade of disinterest in one side or the other. So neutrality, I suppose, is a better thing. I think you also saw leading up to 2016 a lot of false equivalence in the media. There was one thing would be reported on one side that was bad, so something had to be found on the other side in order to appear balanced. What you ended up with would be something serious and something that became serious. I've been wondering over the last week, after Bernie Sanders had a heart attack, why no one's talking about his fitness. I don't mean mental fitness, I mean his physical fitness. Whereas when Hillary Clinton had a cold, everything, she was dying, all of a sudden would die while in office. And even though people knew that wasn't really going to happen, there seemed to be this obligation to report on not just the fact that she was ill, but the possibility of frailty. And people I think have pulled back a bit from that. There's a little bit less of that now, but I think the desire to appear unbiased led to a lot of false equivalency and a lot of playing up of issues or turning into issues, things that didn't really make that big of a difference. Then, of course, you get to election night, and we all drink our own Kool-Aid, I think. So you believe you've done a good job being fair and showing that there are equal numbers of problems on either side of the aisle, and you're ignoring the people who are saying, no, wait, there's something really big over here that all of you are discounting, and you continue to discount it, and you continue to play to your audience, and at 8 o'clock on election night, you realize that all of the predictions aren't right.
Kim, so, back in the good old days, which were probably 10 years ago at this point, there was a sense that if you wrote for the Boston Globe or appeared on NPR or on NBC or one of the major networks, you had a broad audience, and that people might buy the Globe for the Red Sox scores, they might watch NBC because they were watching Seinfeld, but that you could reach a lot of people. And obviously all the surveys now show that, you ask somebody where they get their news, and you can pretty much tell how they vote. As a journalist, I'm wondering, how frustrating is it when you do a story that, affects people or changes people, and yet that at least 43% and maybe 48% of the country will never hear it, or if they hear it, will discount it because of where it's coming from?
And then blame you when, there's an outcome that they don't like. It's very frustrating. I mean, it gets to Lila's point about people not knowing the difference between, for example, news and opinion. I mean, you'll talk to some people, and it's like, who's your favorite journalist? And they'll say Rachel Maddow. And I'll say, Rachel Maddow is not a journalist. Like, I've met her once or twice. She seems perfectly nice. She's not a journalist. And it's that in itself is frustrating, because it's, at least in the days of newspaper, you could see where the editorial and the op-ed pages were. They were set off in a separate part of the paper from the news outlet, and I think there was a little bit more of an understanding then, even still then, it would get confusing. When I worked at the Herald, it was confusing to people. But it's very frustrating. It's also frustrating in an age of Twitter and other social media, where so frequently I feel like I have to use every one of my 280 characters to get as much of my story in the tweet itself, because nobody's going to click on the link. My work is in the link. Click the link, but they don't. And it is very frustrating, because this information is there. The things that, people complain, why isn't anybody talking? My favorite is, why isn't anybody talking about this story? And I'll say, well, how do you know about it? Because you saw a news report about it. People are covering these things. People are covering those stories. But people see news increasingly through their own lens. There was a thought 100 years ago that the change in technology would allow people to be more informed, because you had more sources of information at your fingertips. It's had the absolute opposite effect. Whereas people the confirmation bias, they seek out from that those plethora of sources what they want to know, and if you are not giving them that, either they'll ignore you, or worse, they'll say that you're fake news or that you're not accurate or that you can't be trusted because what you say isn't what they read in this other media source.
Ted, did you have a question you wanted to weigh in with?
It's kind of a follow-up to your answer. Could all of you just talk briefly about how this media market segments at this moment, who watches or listens to what? You had talked earlier about the demographics of your new platform. Could you just talk a little bit about who watches what and why cable is dead or dying?
So cable is not dead because the cable news networks, all three of them, make a lot of money.
Although, actually, Nate, before you do, can we just ask your question, which is, how many people here subscribe to cable, pay for cable television? Okay, can everybody under 50 put their hand down? And let's see it again. How many of you subscribe? Okay, so there's kind of a demographic issue here.
So that gets to the second part of that. It is not dead, but there's definitely, if you look at the number of people subscribing, the number of cable subscribers is a downward trend. So it's progressing down. It will not reverse. With that said, the three cable news networks make a lot of money. All three of them, even though CNN is not as highly rated as the other two, they still make a lot of money. I think what's important to sort of know about that is that the older audience is still there and it's still engaged. These networks are going to try to figure out what to do to try to attract a younger audience. What I'm doing now is we're finding that we engage our news consumers mostly on YouTube, and YouTube attracts a much younger audience. Half of our audience is under 35. With cable news, the audience is much, much older. So it's sort of a different, you're seeing sort of a segmenting of the news product by platform. And not necessarily, that's not a political statement, that's sort of a platform statement, that younger people are sort of engaging in different digital ways, YouTube, Facebook, older audience on cable news. And that's sort of how that dynamic is playing out. But it's important to understand that they're still doing well. One other thing that is very clear right now in the current media landscape is that when there is good news or Trump in the news cycle, whatever it may be, Fox sort of sees a little uptick in their ratings. When there is bad news for Trump, MSNBC sees an uptick in the ratings. So, and it's very clear, like if you sort of like look at the ratings and you sort of chart them and sort of pin them to news events, you could just see it. You could just see it. But it sort of gives a little bit more, it's like another data point to sort of show and like visualize this fragmenting of the media and sort of where the audiences are. CNN is a little bit different. CNN sort of goes up when there's a big breaking news event, whether it's political or apolitical, like something terrible happening somewhere. But that's just an important sort of, it's an important data point just to think about in terms of understanding sort of the segmentation and how Fox's audience is sort of tied into the news cycle as well as MSNBC's audience.
And the under 35s on YouTube, what do they gravitate to in your broadcast?
So the under 35 on YouTube are highly engaged in this is a political news show and political news audience. So in that context, they're highly engaged in the Democratic, primary process, specifically Andrew Yang, Tulsi Gabbard, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. Not so much the other candidates, which is sort of interesting. Not so much Trump, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent, just doesn't sort of resonate in the same way. That may change. These things are not static. They change. As the election advances, and once there's sort of you have a binary choice, things may change. And that's like our job to sort of figure that out and sort of use our journalistic judgment at the same time. But that's sort of what we see at the moment, which I think is very different than cable news, which is sort of it's very binary there. Good news for Trump, it's good for Fox. Bad news for Trump, it's good for MSNBC. CNN is sort of pinned more to breaking news events.
Well, our audience depends what they're looking for. U.S. News, I'm sure you've heard of our rankings. We have some. And we also have a section of consumer advice, which is kind of the news you can use that's been around since the mid-1900s. In terms of our news audience, they skew a little bit older, mostly, 35 to 55. They skew a little bit more educated, completed college, most have completed their master's degree. They skew a little bit more affluent. About a third of our audience is millennial, which is pretty interesting, and that segment has continued to grow. We've addressed it by adopting more of a mobile-first philosophy. We don't do a lot of video, but we do have a lot of informational, shareable content that goes out on social media that you might scroll through while you're commuting, that you might just want to digest really quickly, the headlines, that kind of thing. So that's not your usual demographic. It's hard to offer confirmation instead of information to this particular group. They also they don't skew in any one political direction. Our audience is made up pretty close, half and half, Republicans and Democrats, or I guess Republicans and Republican leaning and Democrats and Democratic leaning, which is unusual for the news space.
So I don't know exactly the demographic breakdown to that level of detail for WBUR or for NPR more broadly. I've been with WBUR since February, and I'm the first Washington-based reporter that they've ever had. So my focus is just a little different, and I'm a little removed. But one thing that I have learned in those months since working for WBUR is my experience largely has been when I tell someone what I do for a living, there's this sense of disdain about it. You're a reporter. Oh, and you cover politics. Just sort of a general negative thing, like how, whether even if it's sympathetic, it's like, how do you do that job? And it seems like so awful. Working for public radio, the reaction that I get when I tell people what to do is, oh, I love NPR. That's wonderful. The public media space is so different when it comes to how people interact with you and how they perceive you and the audience itself, because it is different. There is a built-in buy-in because that's how we operate. We are able to produce the news and programming and everything else we do because of listeners like you. We are literally, they feel invested in that reporting. So it's different, and it's also changes in some aspects. This idea that you're trying to push for ratings or stuff, you're trying to give them, your audience, what they need and what they want, and just to sort of prove that they have invested their money well in you. And so that's a very different thing than working for, a tabloid newspaper, where my job was just, mostly to follow the shiny object in the coverage, and I wasn't really thinking about what was happening on the other end, until things started not to go so well for the Boston Herald. But that's been a really enlightening experience, the way that your audience isn't invisible in the way that it is at other news organizations. You feel like they're in it with you.
So let's put on our pundit hats and kind of pivot to the campaign. Could each of you talk a little bit about how Trump's doing, if there is a method to his madness, and what the path may look like for him for re-election, and then how the Democrats are doing? It seems like the debate last night, I think the press loves it, right? Because it suddenly got more exciting. It looked like it was going to be a coronation, first of Biden, then of Warren, but now suddenly, it seems like there's maybe more of a horse race. How does the race look to you at this point? Nate, you want to start?
Yeah, so I swore off ever making a political prediction again after the last election, and never doing it. So I'm not making a prediction. But I will say one thing, that this is the way it is, and I mean it's what history shows us, is that the odds are in Trump's favor to be reelected. That is sort of incumbent presidents get reelected in the United States. There are a couple exceptions that everyone knows. So with that, understanding the historical context, that he has an advantage, the incumbent has an advantage. He's positioned well. I think there are a couple caveats to that. The midterms are sort of a good indicator that there is a lot of anti-Trump sentiment, pro-democratic sentiment within the country. Democrats did extraordinarily well. I just don't know. We'll see what the dynamic is when you have this choice between him and one other person. The Democratic field is, I think this is sort of this give and take between journalists and politicians that I'm sure everyone's heard. Journalists love talking about the horse race, who's up, who's down. Every politician and policymaker, I think, will tell any journalist they hate when journalists do it. They just want to talk about policy. So there's more coverage, obviously, of the horse race because journalists like to do it. And there's a lot of reasons. They're very sort of easy stories to do. You look at the polling, you make an assessment, you get some pundits to say who's up, who's down. But it does look like now that there is more of a race there. It's not just Joe Biden, that there's more going on, and that is something that plays into, political reporters. That's a good story for a political reporter, that there is some change there, and so there will be a lot of coverage there. I'm sure all the Democratic candidates will bemoan the fact that journalists are covering to a large extent the horse race and not the policies they're talking about. But you'll probably see a lot more coverage of that in the coming days.
Can I jump in with a point on that? I think for Democrats, it's a lot harder for them than normal. In a lot of ways, conventional wisdom doesn't apply. I mean, I was waiting until after Labor Day and really not, sort of taking the polls before Labor Day with a shaker of salt, because people were tuned out. They're worried about enrolling their kids in schools, and so they weren't really paying attention. They'll do it now, and this is normally the time where that happens. There's also an impeachment inquiry going on. There is also the flurry of news that we talked about before that we have never seen leading up to a presidential election. There are also 287 Democratic candidates for president. So it is very, very difficult. I mean, on this issue that Nate was talking about, them wanting to talk policy, it's a win for them if their name is mentioned in a news cycle. So it's very, very difficult for them to break through. And so one thing that we saw happen very early is the candidates with the name recognition rose to the top very quickly. You had Joe Biden, who didn't just have name recognition, he was a known commodity. He was a part of the Obama administration for 8 years. You have Elizabeth Warren, someone who's been in Washington now 6-7 years. And has had some time to make her own name, and you have other people who, the lower the name recognition, it's been tougher. You've had some people who sort of burst on the scene, like Pete Buttigieg, and sort of has made some impact, at least his ability to fundraise. He spends a lot of time in Massachusetts fundraising, by the way. So you might be the easiest candidate if anybody wants to meet him. Just sign up, and he'll probably have a fundraiser near you.
Northeastern. Yeah.
Yes, he was. I was there when he was here. So yeah, it's a lot tougher for them to try to break out in any way, whether it's through policy or through sort of, how good of a jab one got against another in a debate. On the point of Donald Trump, everything that Nate said is absolutely right. There's certainly a favorability for an incumbent. As you were saying that, I was thinking back in my head, and I think there have only, in my lifetime at least, I think only 2 incumbent presidents lost re-election. Very rarely happens. I will add more data points to that. His support, it's never a majority, but it's a plurality that hasn't budged. The very same people who voted for him have this idea that there would be this voter's remorse where people will say, oh, I wanted to give this guy a chance, but I don't like all this stuff he's doing. I can't believe that that's not happening. All of the factors that were in place that led to his election are still in place. All of the issues that propelled him still remained. Immigration, huge issue that propelled him with him hit the wall, the complete and total shutdown of Muslims entering the country. That sentiment that brought the support he got from that remains. Judicial appointments, the deal he struck with the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation to appoint very conservative justices and judges across the federal judiciary that got him the very, very strong evangelical support remains. Everything, business policy, the economy is doing well. All those things remain. So for there to be a different outcome, it depends on who the Democratic nominee is and what that Democratic nominee does. And it's too early right now to know the answer of either of those questions. But I wouldn't call that a prediction. I would just say, looking at the information that we know based on what's happened in the past, those are the things that we know. And at this point, that gives him just a political advantage right now.
I think the Democrats acknowledge that because they're constantly talking about who can beat Trump. So they acknowledge that he's entering this race with a bit of an advantage. As for why we cover the horse race, news covers what's new, and what's new is the constant level of change in the horse race. The policy issues aren't new. In fact, the policy issues, what people tend not to mention is that presidential candidates can't do these things on their own. They don't create laws. They sign laws in the Oval Office, but they're not the ones that are offering legislation. That's in the House and in the Senate. I think, well, we love the horse race so much that U.S. News just launched America 2020. So we're covering the horse race, we're covering the issues, we're covering all of that because that's the stuff that changes. Predictions, I'm firmly in the camp of strange women lying in ponds distributing swords as a great basis for a system of government right now. But I think it's too early to tell. We're still in that crazy clown car portion of the election cycle when you open the door and candidates you've never even heard of are either entering the race or exiting the race. I mean, Steyer, no, he was on the stage last night, and people are like, where did he come from? Who is this person? And I don't care about his policy. He's a billionaire. How did he get there? So he's the candidate who's saying we need to take money out of government by throwing more money into government. So it's way too early. Right now, all of the Democratic candidates are making a bid to the most vocal portions of the Democratic Party, the people who will take the day off to caucus in Iowa, the people who will actually go to the polls and vote during the primaries. Those are not the middle-of-the-road moderates. So you're hearing a lot of stuff that, frankly, once you do have a smaller pool of candidates, and definitely once you have one Democratic candidate, you're going to hear something different. And it's not going to be horse racy. That's when policies will actually matter instead of the politics.
Although let me follow up on that, because it seems to me, again, in the good old days, 8 years ago, I mean, it was possible to pivot, right? You could say, you could play to your base and then pivot. But now, given not only the intensity of coverage, but the engagement of so many people, it seems to me, I wonder, I mean, and I think this has become conventional wisdom, how hard will it be for Elizabeth Warren to walk back from Medicare for All when not only do the Republicans already have enough kind of, debate footage to sort of attack this with her, but frankly, enough people have been watching the debates, there's been enough saturation coverage, you can't get away from it, that any attempt to pivot will be seen as flip-flopping. I mean, I wonder if that conventional dynamic, which was run to the base in the primary, pivot away for the general, has been skewed by a new media environment, which kind of places people in amber, and they can't change because, we've all got the tape and we've all heard it 100 times already.
I think that's a good point. I'm not sure that there would be an ability to pivot. I also know that if she is elected, she can't just magically institute Medicare for all. So the real question is, how are you going to work with Congress to enact the policies you're promoting? And no one's asking that question. I'd be very interested in hearing their responses. I'm not sure any of them would have a good one, frankly. But the idea of flip-flopping and the danger of flip-flopping, I don't think that's new. Even in the good old days of 8 years ago, I think that if you made a very strong play to your base and then pivoted and made an equally strong play to the middle section of the voting public, you'd be reprimanded for it. I think
just ask President Kerry.
Exactly, which is what makes me think that she and Sanders, this is their platform. This is not, the Medicare for All is not a play to their base. They're counting on other voters, more moderate voters, to also care about this issue. But again, I want to know how they think they'll make it happen. I haven't heard anything about that yet.
Kim, you're grimacing and nodding, so which is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, people have always flip-flopped. I think, yeah, now there's a tape and a tweet for everything. It's immortalized in a way that was a little different before. I think it depends on the skill of the politician, right? I mean, I don't know, some of you are young. When I was covering the Massachusetts State House, there was a governor there named Mitt Romney who was very moderate. He promised he had no interest in changing laws with respect to same-sex marriage. He was pro-choice. He was all these things when he needed to be those things to be the governor of Massachusetts. Then, just as he was preparing to leave the door, he suddenly held a rally in front of the State House against same-sex marriage. He had his evolution on abortion and became staunchly pro-life. And he went and ran, none of those things really hurt him because he was then appealing to the National Republican Party. That never really came back to bite. Remember when Ted Cruz thought that Donald Trump was the devil, it's a horrible person.
Or Lindsey Graham.
Or anybody else. We see these kinds of pivots happen in real time all of the time. It depends. I think Ted Cruz has been a little more savvy with his pivot than Lindsey Graham has, but I think it depends on how well they do it. I think if Elizabeth Warren or anybody else has to make these changes and moderate, that it's possible if they do it right. I mean, I think you saw Hillary Clinton come out and explain in very clear and very convincing terms how she believed that actions she took on things like the 1994 crime bill were wrong, and she was regretful at some of the outcomes that were unintended. She sort of kind of faced up to it, and I thought in a way that was very effective. We've seen Joe Biden not do so well kind of facing up these things. I think it depends on the skill. I don't think that's going to knock them out completely.
So, sorry. Let me just follow up with Nate, and then
Okay.
Because Nate, you've journalistically covered Trump longest, I think, among everyone here, both in New York and the White House, and interviewing him in the White House. I mean, is he somebody who hasn't changed at all, or has he gotten better at it? I mean, there was this theory after he was elected that he would move to the center and become more presidential. That hasn't happened. Some people think if he just didn't talk for 6 months, he'd win overwhelmingly. I mean, what goes on with him, do you think?
So, for lack of a better cliche, Trump is Trump. I think at this point, everyone knows what you're getting with him. There was this notion early on that this is the day he's finally president. Like that's not a thing. Like he is who he is. It will not change. That's what you're getting. I think one of the things when you sort of talk about him as a candidate, as a politician, as opposed to sort of a policymaker and president, is that he is also a showman. Like he understands a show, like how to tell a story, how to engage an audience. And that's like it's like catnip for the media. It's the reason why CNN last time around took all of his rallies from start to finish. I think they've acknowledged in hindsight that may have not been the best call, but they didn't do it because they liked or disliked Trump. They did it because they saw this entertainment value, if you will. And Trump understands that. And it's very appealing to the media when you have someone who's entertaining. And that's not sort of ascribing the ideological part of where he's coming from. It's sort of an understanding media, especially the visuals. And the Democratic nominee is going to be up against that. At some point they're going to be on the same stage with him, and he's going to be doing what he does. and they need to do something to either break through, or it's a real challenge. And that's something a little bit different. That's not a policy challenge. It's not an ideological challenge. It's sort of a performance challenge that they face, which is something that I think oftentimes people don't think about, though he does a lot. And you can see that he likes spectacles, right? Like that's why he went to meet the North Korean dictator. Like he likes these events. Like he understands the value of that. This is someone who like the character that he created on The Apprentice, like he understood the value in that to an audience. And it's a little too simplistic to say he's sort of playing a role right now, but that's part of what you're seeing. Like he understands how to make things that have been traditionally dry and dull not. And that is very, very appealing to the media, even when media outlets say they're not, and they're not going to fall for it again. They do time and time again.
So in that same vein, it's not 180 degrees, but different from playing to showmanship, right? A year from now, we're going to elect someone who's going to have to be the chief executive of largest corporation and most powerful nation probably in the history of the world. And that requires some competence to manage things. And one of Trump's purported advantages early on was that he's a businessman, whatever people thought that meant. One of the kinds of questions that the media can ask that address the question of competence to run a system of this size and complexity.
I think one of the things that we should have asked early on is, how is the country like or not like a business? I mean, I think we've discovered that having a businessman see himself as CEO of America doesn't work, because the judiciary is not your personal legal team. The Justice Department is not your security. You can't fire Congress. You can shuffle around your cabinet as many times as you want, but they still need confirmation by Congress, and having a cabinet made up of majority acting officials isn't functioning very well. So I think the media needs to do a better job of explaining that it's not a simple company situation, that the parallel is not quite that simple. I think the bar is being reset for determining competence. I think there's the question is, you're going to fill your cabinet with people who are going to be in these jobs. What criteria will you use to choose them? Who would you fill these positions with? I think that will say a lot more than the candidate's competencies. A better way to evaluate the candidate's competency may be to see who else they think is competent to work with them.
I also think that, yes, the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, is as you said, the head of this great organization, in being the executive branch of government. But competency is in the eye of the voter. It's very different than someone going before a board or applying for a job, and you look at their resume. When it gets down to it, after a political campaign season and a presidential election, any election is essentially at its core a government-run popularity contest. It's literally a popularity contest. And we've elected people with very little political experience at all, and someone like Barack Obama, who remains quite popular. He didn't have any executive experience at all, had some limited legislative experience, and he was very popular. You had someone like Ronald Reagan, who was an actor. I mean, he became governor, but he became governor after being an actor, who was a very popular president. I don't know that it's necessarily obviously they have to make that pitch, and different candidates are doing it in different ways. Elizabeth Warren, for example, is putting out our plans to make it, seem like from day one that she can get moving, or other people. They have to do it the way that they did. I will again say, Donald Trump proved exactly who he was during the campaign. It wasn't like there was some pitch that, hey, this is a really great, successful businessman. There were lots of stories about the inflation of the Trump organization and the way that he would inflate the value when he needed to get a loan, or deflate it when he was trying to get out of a bankruptcy proceeding. We knew that the amount of money that he claimed to have was unconfirmed because he refused to release his tax returns. And there were all kinds of other investigations going into the Trump organization. So people knew this whole shtick about him being this great businessman wasn't true. His supporters didn't care. They still liked what he was saying, and he was the most popular with them. So I'm not sure we can write stories till, the end of time about his business acumen. I'm not sure that that's the factor that makes the difference.
I think what's very hard to reconcile, maybe for this audience and for a lot of people, is that when you look at the issue of competency, his biggest pitch the last campaign was build the wall. Said it over and over, build the wall, build the wall, build the wall. Every rally, people chanted it. The wall is not built. It's not going to be built before the election. But his supporters are still supporting him. And it's very hard to reconcile that. I fully understand how hard it is to understand that, but that's what we see. Like that was his pitch. Build the wall. There is no wall, and his support has not faded.
So we're going to open it up to questions, but I wanted to ask one final question, which is kind of a bit higher level. It's not about a horse race, but, in our class, we're reading How Democracy Dies. And there is, I think, a conversation going on among a lot of people about this moment. And is there something more dangerous than usual? Those of us old enough can say, well, were people like this during Nixon? Were people like this during Reagan? Were things like this during Clinton's impeachment? But I think the media is often talked about, along with other institutions, as being part of the guardrails here that are being challenged, perhaps in ways. Although, as people point out, Nixon did a lot of the things Trump would only like to do, and obviously there's a nostalgia about Obama that covers up a lot of the tensions that were there too. But I'm wondering, as media members, maybe at 2 a.m. or maybe Friday as you're unwinding, is there part of you that worries? Is there part of you that worries a little bit that this is different, or will we look back 20 years from now and say, well, that was just another cycle of American history?
I worry about it a lot. Yeah, one reason why I was drawn to journalism was because of its role as, the fourth estate, its role in democracy, and the fact that, in the eyes of, I'm less worried about what the president or other officials in Washington say about us. I'm very concerned about the trust or lack thereof. The diminishing trust that the public has in the press, because we cannot continue to do what we do if the public does not trust us and does not understand the importance of journalists, not just, as an industry, but as a part of democracy. It worries me a lot. I mean, I'll take it back. It's not that I don't care about what elected officials or other people in Washington say. I do. I mean, I've been to China as a journalist, and let me tell you, that is not a fun place to be when you're a journalist, but it was really trippy to be there and to, through, a VPN and all kinds of tricks, because Twitter is blocked in China, see tweets from the president excoriating the press and calling them the enemy of the people. And I'm in a country where, journalists disappear, I think we can do a better job of really explaining that, of not coming from a defensive place, but coming from a place of civic education. I mean, I think that's a pet cause for me. I think that people really need to understand better what journalists do, including the points that we brought up, the difference between opinion and news. I think a lot of it is just a lack of understanding, but a lot of it is a lot of people with very large bullhorns really saying, really eroding the trust in the press. And I think it's going to be long lasting. I don't know if it's just a cyclical thing that comes and goes. I think that there's going to have to be an affirmative effort to rebuild trust in journalism. And one way that it's just for us to work really hard to get it right and to earn that trust little by little, step by step, so that, if my listeners and readers trust what I say, that's a step in the right direction. And that's what I try to do for my part.
I have to agree. What keeps me up at night is the idea that that people view the press as the enemy. Yes. We are your eyes and ears everywhere. When we are kicked out of a press conference, you are kicked out of the press conference. When we are forbidden from covering something that our elected officials are doing, you are the one who is kept in the dark. The journalists, we don't go to bed going, I really wonder what was in that tax return. We want to find out because you all deserve to know. The fact that not just trust that's eroding, but the idea that journalism itself doesn't matter is problematic. And I'm not sure how we get past that right now, because we can talk about the importance of journalism ad nauseum. I mean, we do. We can talk about the need to rebuild trust. We can do our very best to be our very best at all times, journalistically. But if people still are cheering when a press conference is shut down, or when people are boarding airplanes with rope tree journalists, some assembly required written on the back, and no one's upset about it except journalists, I don't see that trust returning, and I don't see that people see the danger in what it can be like to not have people who are willing to dig and find out what's going on. Every single thing that is happening right now that's come to light has come to light because journalists have been digging it up and reporting on it. And I think that people forget that the reason we're doing that isn't to take down this person or to bolster that person or to instate that person or to wreck that person's chances. It's because as consumers, as citizens, you deserve to be informed.
I'm going to preface this by saying I am probably naive and optimistic, which is a very bad combination. But I don't sort of see the threat as big or as looming as you guys do. But I do think there's a couple things at play that there's two things going on, that journalism is under attack, and we see that all the time. It's also, a very good time to be a journalist, because there are stories that need to be told and can be told, and there are people, especially in Washington, D.C., who are willing to talk in a way that, especially in the executive branch, who have never spoken before to journalists, and you could tell those stories. I think one of the biggest challenges is that consumers of news, do not understand what journalists do. They just don't understand it. And I think the publisher of the New York Times said that they were trying to do more of, like when you were doing your math homework, saying, like, show your work, like how you came to the answer, not just the answer. And I think journalists need to do more showing their work. Like, people do need to understand what goes into a story. Like, journalists spend hours and hours trying to confirm what may be a sentence in a story, or days, or months, or years. And the public doesn't sort of have a sense or appreciation of that. It's very hard to sort of tell that story. It's not really that exciting to most people, but that's part of sort of the process to sort of getting back, is that you need to show your work. People need to understand sort of the process that you're getting to this. It's not like when you say, like, sometimes like quotes from the senior administration official are just sort of, a White House official just saying stuff. But sometimes these anonymous sources are people who are risking their lives to talk. And people don't, I think, fully have an appreciation for that, which is sort of maybe one of the steps to rebuilding it.
I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Before we get started, I just want to remind the students that there were a lot of questions in class, and not all of you got a chance to ask them. So in addition to the community members, the students should also feel free to raise their hands, and we'll try to alternate.
Could you address the role of comedy, the Colberts of the world? Are they effective? Are they getting people riled up about or interested in politics, or are they kind of making it just funny and you can't go any deeper than that?
I think they're playing to their audiences. People who watch Colbert aren't the same people who will be turning on Fox News and then watching O'Reilly or Tucker Carlson. So there's a lot of confirmation instead of information at play there. I think they're doing a good job, though, of meeting certain audiences where they are. A lot of the audiences of the Colbert Report of last week tonight with John Oliver of The Daily Show aren't people who would traditionally sit in front of a news broadcast, not necessarily, and watch all that. But they're still getting the gist of what's going on. What I do think comedians are doing well is asking some of the tough questions that unbiased news outlets are maybe reluctant to ask. And so it's interesting to me to see how the responses change in those late night talkies. But I also think they towed the line, or they don't toe the line. There is no line. They are straight onto the opinion side of things. They're not making an effort to be unbiased. They're telling you what they think about what's going on and telling you why you should be outraged or why you should be applauding.
I think there's also data to point that out. When Colbert is a good example. When he started, the show was not his current show on CBS. It did not do that well, and they sort of pivoted to political comedy and almost exclusively anti-Trump, and it did very well. The show sort of took off, so they realized there is an audience that wants that type of comedy. I think you sort of saw the reverse with Jimmy Fallon. Jimmy Fallon did this, I don't know if you recall, it was during the campaign, this very like chummy bit with Trump, and there was a lot of backlash that he was like he's too close to him, and like you're sort of yucking it up with him. That's not the right thing. So in sort of that world, you could see that like it's very clear that there's sort of one side that works, and it works well. There's a big audience for that type of comedy.
I think it's also shifted. Remember all the backlash when Clinton went on Arsenio? That was different. That was considered lowering, like beneath the dignity of the audience, right? He whipped out the saxophone, and what he was doing though was trying to meet voters where they are, trying to reach a group of people who maybe wouldn't listen to what he had to say otherwise. So I think the role of the late night shows have changed a bit over time.
I think that's true, and I think when you talk to, especially like on background people who work in campaigns, they know that they go on cable news and they'll do news interviews, but they know getting your candidate on Ellen sort of can really move the needle. Like that's something that you're sort of reaching a different audience. It's more of like a cultural aspect than just purely political. Like and that sort of, it feeds into that same notion that these are things where you're sort of trying to humanize your candidate, broader audience, more cultural, less political, and that's that every candidate wants to be on.
And Nate got to that point. I think there's a difference between a candidate appearing on a talk show or a comedy show or something and the comedy show itself, like the Colberts and the This Tonight, Tomorrow shows. I'm sorry, I don't watch them, but there are people who get their news from that shows. And again, that is not journalism. That is an entertainment show. On the other hand, it's always existed. My grandmother used to watch The Tonight Show for her news. She used to get her news from Johnny Carson. She would tell us that. So an element of that has existed totally. I think the Clinton thing was different. There was backlash not from the black community. That was Bill Clinton making a savvy political pitch. At the time, young people watched Arsenio, and so he went on there. He went on MTV. He did things that were very, very politically smart to do, and that benefited him.
I'd like to ask some questions about the coming year because we're almost a year from the election. And I think there are a lot of things that are going to be challenges for you to cover in that time frame. What's the flip? What would impact the Trump vote? And I think, is it fair to assume that if 1 million or 1.5 million of his previous voters didn't vote for him? And I'm wondering about your view of the military's disappointment in what's happening in Syria with the Kurds, the farmers who've not been able to sell their soybeans despite some subsidies, the tariff impacts, people who are tired of the chaos, the expertise and experience of Nancy Pelosi, the niche support from Syrians in places like Michigan who voted for him substantially and might not vote now, the vice president choice for the Democrats.
Yeah, I feel I understand where you're getting at. I think the gist of that kind of goes to the point that I made earlier. So far, his support, based on polling, and I know polling, people distrust polling. I don't look at one poll to make any sort of prediction or assumption about it, but polling is very effective to test momentum over time. And we have had 3 years now of polling of Donald Trump's presidency, where all kinds of things have happened, where he has, praised white supremacists, where he has all the things that you mentioned. Those numbers haven't moved. That's what I meant by all the factors that led to his election haven't changed. Farmers, we talked to farmers. We went to cranberry country where there are some people who are hurting, but there's also people there who are saying, I'm still with him. It's more than about those issues. I think at the heart is a bunch of things. The people who voted for him are the people for whom immigration is the top issue for them. There are other people who it's for a lesser plurality is about the judiciary or other things. Now, you started your question with what could happen to change that. I believe that if the economy were to substantially be hit before Election Day, if there was a big economic downfall, that could be problematic for him. I cannot think of any other move. Yeah, people are upset about this move in Syria. People were upset when he wanted to pull troops out of Afghanistan too. People have been upset when he met with Kim Jong-un. I mean, I feel like that's another news cycle. I think the biggest difference will be what the Democratic nominee brings, how the Democratic nominee will have to galvanize voters, how they will have to appeal. And it's a harder pitch, right? They have to appeal to the folks who are farmers. They have to appeal to people of color. They have to explain to young people why they need to get registered. They should be doing that right now, why they need to get registered for this election because what the stakes are. They need to appeal to people in places like Florida who may have had conservative views, but who also have relatives whose homes in Puerto Rico were destroyed, and now they don't know what to do. There's a lot of work for Democrats to do to change that momentum, but everything that Trump has done, he's at least, he hasn't built the wall, but he's been trying, and he can just blame, the Democrats in Congress for fighting him come Election Day. But everything else, his America First foreign policy, his immigration policies, everything that he promised on the campaign trail, he's delivered.
I think that the economy is the only issue, and if you look at the two incumbent presidents that lost, it was because the economy went south while they were running. That's the only thing, and looking back at history, that sort of leads you to sort of this drastic change.
I think it's worth remembering that no matter which political party we're talking about, there's a segment of the base that would rather not vote than vote for someone from the other party. So the issue is less about how many votes would he have to lose in order for the Democrats to win, and it's more about how many more people would the Democrats need to get off their couch and out of their barca loungers into the polls in order for Trump to lose. All of the issues that you mentioned are really important. I think the people on the left who care most about them are already voting and would never vote for Trump. I think the people on the right who care about them, I think there's a good portion of them who would rather stay home than vote against Trump.
Or they tune those things out and they're going to vote for him because he's delivering on whatever issue that made them vote for him in the first place.
And if we were talking about, the opposite scenario, if we were talking about an incumbent Democrat and similarly bad things had been happening, I think you'd see the same thing. You'd see the people on the right who cared about those issues the people on the left who cared about those issues would probably rather not vote than vote for someone on the right. And the people on the right who care about them would be voting anyway.
Does the media have a role or a responsibility to mitigate, or if not mitigate, at least not reinforce our tribalism? And if so, what would that mitigation look like?
That's a great question. It's a hard one to answer. I think ideally the media's role is to inform. I don't think the media's role is to lecture, though I'm doing that right now. I think that people don't want to turn on the news or open up the paper or log in to the website and read a screed about why what they're thinking or doing or how they're acting is wrong, or why the other side the sides need to come together. And I feel that by conflating opinion and reporting, and by promoting confirmation rather than information, the media itself has damaged itself a great deal. I'm not sure how to get away from that. The tribalism that's in politics, I think a lot of it comes from a place of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the other side, fear of losing power, fear of having a marginalized group treat you the way they have historically been treated. I don't know that the media can do anything about that other than inform, other than continue to tell stories, perhaps by humanizing it more, by explaining why it matters and why it should matter to certain readers, to their readers. Maybe that's one way they can right the ship, but I'm not sure that it can be done. It's going to be a long process. I don't see it happening immediately.
Yeah, or with facts. I mean, on that issue, you hit the nail on the head with fear. That is a big tool that has been used by the administration to push its policies. You know, things like the immigrants are criminals, and so then we go to the FBI's own statistics to show that immigrants, both legal and illegal, in the country, both legally and illegally, commit far fewer crimes than American-born citizens and things. We can do that as much as we can. It's not. It doesn't. You need the audience to receive it, and that's the part that's out of one's control. As a journalist, you can be factual, you can be contextual, which I think is really important, and that gets to the issue of equivalence. The context is really important. I don't think that we should not have reported on Hillary Clinton vigorously and thoroughly. She was a candidate for president, but you give context around all of it, and I think that's something that was lacking at the time, and that was an issue, but. Yeah.
I think it's a great question, and sort of at the root of it is something that journalists do not like to talk about, which is that they work for businesses. The businesses need to make money. So journalists are supposed to be sort of agnostic when it comes to that part. You're sort of telling stories, using your judgment, you're doing that, but if the company doesn't exist, you can't do that. So there's this pressure that's oftentimes unsaid that you have to. If you don't have an audience, you don't have a company to tell your stories, right? You don't have this entity to do it. So there's a pressure to engage your audience. I think the tribalism is a very easy way right now, sort of appealing to one side or the other, to engage an audience and make money and have your business growing. Now there are ways to sort of get away from that, which is public radio, public TV. There are news entities that are nonprofits, like ProPublica, that are sprouting up. So they're sort of like it's not all bad, but I think that's one of the things, at least right now, that's at like the root of that is that the tribalism sells.
So I think that Trump is definitely Trump is the problem, but also the people. He has enabled and allowed people to act this way and normalized hate crimes. And what do you think, even if he isn't elected, will this polarization go away? And how do you recommend that we combat this?
It's certainly Donald Trump represents something that already existed in the country. He just was better through his showmanship and other tools, was just able to tap into it and make it a political asset. So certainly that those divisions and those sentiments will remain. They preceded him. We saw that coming a lot, at least I did, particularly during the Obama administration. There was almost an immediate uptick in really hateful, racist, awful sentiment being in very conservative, then more underground media about him. That was some of the things that he tapped into. A lot of the people who, who perpetuated some of that stuff, Trump has surrounded himself with and elevated and given them more of a voice. He has created an atmosphere through which, there was once upon a time where white supremacists would wear robes and hoods. Now they can do it out in the open wearing button-down shirts and carrying torches. He is certainly fueling that and making it more open, making more space for that to come out in the open. But even after he leaves and that sentiment goes back underground, it's still there. It's just underground. Some folks will still be fully aware of it, more aware of it than others. So in that sense, no, that's going to remain for much longer. That's a societal issue. He just sort of tapped into it.
In terms of what individuals can do to mitigate that, is be aware, be vocal about not agreeing with certain sentiments. If you see inequity, work to adjust it. I think the way it changes is on an individual level. I don't think that society as a whole will pivot. It's really hard to parallel park a Mack truck, but it's really easy to put a skateboard away or to line them all up. So I think what you're going to need to do, you collectively, everyone, is make that change on an individual basis within yourself and within the people you know, and hopefully at some point we will see change. But I don't think it's going to go away just with this election.
I think that's right. There's nothing new that there are hateful people in this country. That's always been here. But there is something to this notion that the people who have these views feel emboldened. And during it was a good retort by Andrew Gillum in the Florida governor race during the midterms, where he was talking about his opponent, saying, "Look, you may not be a racist, but the racists, like you." And that's sort of what we're seeing, that that people who have these views feel emboldened, and it may not be as simple as just sort of changing the character at the top to sort of dial that back.
All right, so I have two questions. The first one is about the media, and the second is about the election. So the first one is, do you think the media as a whole, mainstream media, has too much of a pro-establishment, pro-status quo bias, and that's why we see a lot of people flocking to independent media? And the second question is, do you think the Democrats will lose the election if they nominate a more moderate candidate like they did in 2016?
Tough. What are you both look at me?
That's a hard one.
Pro-establishment bias in the media.
I think the media does have a pro-establishment bias. I think that there's this thinking that people see Andrew Yang on the stage, and he's this guy he's some guy who has this crazy idea to give everyone $1,000 and it's not going to go anywhere, and sort of dismissed. And part of it is that he's also these candidates they just don't poll as well as the other candidates. And you could ask, is that a chicken egg? Do they not poll well because they don't get enough attention, or do they? That's for you to decide. But I definitely think there's something to that. Who would be best to go up against Trump is hard. it's hard to say, this is going back to my no prediction rule, but it's hard to say whether or not sort of where on the ideological spectrum which works better, or if it just depends how you see it. It's clear from polling that most Democratic primary voters see the number one issue is beating Trump. Everything else is secondary. So they're sort of looking at it through that prism. They want to beat Trump. Who that is, I think, is still being worked out. Like we're seeing that process play out, and it's hard to say. Like if you look at the map and you look at the math, and everything sort of stays the same from the last election, you need to flip, a certain number of votes in a couple of key states. And does moving to the left do that? Maybe, maybe not. Does having a candidate who's charismatic and sort of can match Trump on this level of, showmanship or something close, would that help more? Maybe a combination of both. I think you just have to see where sort of the electorate goes on that.
And also, but as between all of the 287 Democratic candidates, the differences between them ideologically is like, the circle that's made by this bottle, and Trump is here. I mean, I don't think that's going to be the main factor, how ideological Elizabeth Warren is versus Joe Biden is. That's going to be the main factor in how they do. I think you're right. I think it has to do a lot more with their ability to prove that they can beat Donald Trump. That literally is, whether you are in Iowa, whether you're in South Carolina, whether you're in Pennsylvania, whether you are in New Hampshire, the number one thing that voters will say to you is beating Donald Trump is their number one issue.
I think the answer to both your questions is yes and no. Does the media tend to value the establishment more? Yes and no. Yes, they tend to retell the same stories. They know what this story is going to be if you're hewing to the establishment line. I think a lot of people would say that covering impeachment is attacking the establishment, or that pointing out the flaws in a campaign is attacking the establishment. So I think it could be yes and no. I think that's just the job. You cover the news. Would a more moderate candidate mean the Democrats wouldn't lose? Again, yes and no. I agree with you that ideologically, things are so polarized right now that anything that's not firmly in your camp is seen as against your camp. And so being moderate versus being very progressive, it makes a difference in terms of the number of your own camp that may come out for you, but I don't think it makes a difference to the people who are on the other side of the aisle. I think that's where I go there. I don't see a clear answer.
I just to throw in, one of the things that strikes me, and maybe if this is an incumbency problem, maybe it's a Democratic problem. It seems to me the Democrats have been here before, up against a popular Republican president who they loathe, right? Nixon, Reagan, now Trump. And to many Democrats, it's so obvious what the case is, and they go through a very long primary process with lots of different candidates, come up with someone who they think is the right fit, whether it's Dukakis or Kerry or Mondale, and then end up getting destroyed. And this is starting to feel a bit like that. Watching the debate, I felt like it was almost like if you could establish the Frankenstein Democratic candidate with Pete Buttigieg's, military record and Elizabeth Warren's plans and Joe Biden's appeal to the heartland. But it seems to me they're having trouble finding. And I also wonder if when the history is written 20 years from now, the generation gap will show up. That you've got three people in their 70s who are sort of dominating things, and somehow that middle level of the 50-somethings that you thought would have risen by this time, and frankly who the Republicans have. The Republicans look pretty strong going forward. They've got Nikki Haley, they've got Rubio, they've kind of John Kasich, they've got people there. And I think in some ways the Democrats, both in 2016 perhaps and now, are kind of are kind of caught because of the generational thing. I want to ask one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. There's been no talk of gender, which kind of overwhelmed a lot of the conversations in 2016 with Hillary Clinton as the first candidate. We now have candidates of color running, candidates who are women running. Is gender just now kind of been there, done that, or not for this campaign? I'm just wondering if that's come up at all.
No, I think it's still a big deal, actually. Because we're still a society where we say the first. It's still the first woman to X, or the first woman of color to X. So I think it's still a thing. What you see right now in the Democratic field, though, is really hopeful. You've got people of color, you've got women, you've got millennials, you've got veterans, you've got people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community. You've got a lot of intersectionality. You've got, Bernie Sanders, yes, the old white guy, also Jewish. You've got a lot of different groups represented on that stage. The question is, who will be the last one standing, who gets to represent the party? And I think that, yeah, it could be, being a woman isn't going to be seen as detrimentally as it maybe had in the past. But I do think that no matter who ends up on the stage, you will see a ticket that is mixed. You will not see a woman presidential candidate with a female vice presidential candidate. You will not see, I don't think you will see a male presidential candidate with a male vice presidential candidate. So maybe that's an indication that the tide is turning, or maybe that's a cynical play for the voters. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and it's in that sense, on that last point, that's why you used to see candidates, when they were all white guys. One was from the East, and you had to pick somebody from the South or the Midwest as their running mate and things like that. So that doesn't change. Gender still matters very much, even among the most supportive of voters. One of the things that I hear from voters that I find really interesting is the comment the voter who says, I really like Elizabeth Warren. I really like her plans. I like her platform. I fear that people won't vote for her because she's a woman. So she's not talking about her support. She's talking about her fear of what other people will do based on gender bias affecting what decisions she makes about who she wants to win the primary. That's the sort of thing. I like Cory Booker, but I don't think that people will vote for another black president right now. I like this person. I like Buttigieg, but I don't think that somebody's going to vote for a gay person. It's not that their support, it's this fear about what society will do. Even though, this fear that people won't vote for a woman garnered 3 million more votes in the last presidential election than her opponent, but there's still that fear there. There's this thought about what our society is and what we still haven't overcome. And I think that's the polarization and the tone of a lot of the political discourse right now is fueling that fear.
I think that's right. I think the issue of gender is obviously a big issue. And I think we discussed it a little bit before, and you could say it's gender or not. Hillary Clinton last election cycle coughed in public, and there were endless stories about, is she frail? Is she okay? What's going to happen? Can she have spent 4 years in the White House? Bernie Sanders literally has a heart attack, and people just move on. And so, is that there are other things at play there? It's not necessarily just a gender issue. I think the different campaigns sort of handle the two issues differently, but there's definitely something there. So the gender roles it's still very clear, and it makes a difference.
Well, the three of you have spent almost 2 hours off of Twitter, which is extraordinary in these times. So God only knows what's been happening. But I want to thank you so much. It was really, really terrific. Thank you. And I hope we'll see you all here for our discussion about climate change next week. Thanks very much.